So I'm Writing a Novel is the show where you join me, Oliver Brackenbury, on the journey of writing my next novel, from first ideas all the way to publication and promotion. In this one-man reality show, I'll share with you my ever-evolving thoughts and feelings on how I write, being a writer, and everything that entails at each stage of the process. I'll also interview special guests involved in writing and publishing. If you're the kind of person who likes to learn how things are made and get to know the people making them, then this is the show for you. I'd like to say a quick thank you to our Patreon supporters who make this show possible. Patrons get to listen to episodes of the show early and gain access to a treasure trove of bonus content that I'm regularly adding to, including over 70 bonus episodes, the TV pilot screenplay I wrote with the novel's character, and more. Please check it out at patreon.com/soimwritinganovel. The Order of the Dragon sends its bloodiest knights, Hieronymus of Sorn and Prospero Lucetti, to purge the heretics of the Baltic coast. Yet, when death and sorcery thunder them into a realm other than their own, these paladins find themselves beset by beasts, by doubt, and by their own blessed, crumbling minds. Pursued by Walpurgia, sworn nun of the dragon, bride of the Gnosis, and lover to a knight, Hieronymus and Prospero themselves hunt what all knights seek: blood, and the redemption found in blood. Inspired by the works of McCarthy, Wolfe, and Chrétien de Troyes, Contra Amatores Mundi is a novella of swords, sorcery, and medieval Gothic fantasy. It's also a recent publication, a novella, by Graham Thomas Wilcox, who you may recall from appearing on the show before, along with his partner Caitlin, as an editor of Old Moon Quarterly magazine. Due to the quality of Old Moon Quarterly magazine and conversations I've had with Graham and some of his writing I've read before in said magazine, I'm of the opinion that anything Graham does is worth checking out and discussing. So hey, good thing I've got him on the show this week, eh? Alright, let's go chat with Graham about his new novella. And here I am with Graham Thomas Wilcox. Hey, man.
Hello.
So I just like to start off, kind of in the shallow end. Like, how long has this been germinating? How long was it from, very first, what if I did a thing, to, publication?
Oh, I think it was probably about maybe 2 or 3 years. It started out as an idea for a short story that I wrote, I think for probably Beneath Ceaseless Skies, I think was probably the market that I was aiming it at. And it got a few rejections. I sent it to all the markets, essentially, that seemed like they would accept the longer works of sort of sword and sorcery-esque fantasy. And it garnered a few rejections. And I thought, well, I like it a lot, so I think I'll keep working on it and see if I can make it into something maybe a little bit longer. And I was reading a bunch of novellas around that time. I was kind of on a novella kick. And I thought I would try my hand at it.
So, you and I spoke a little bit off mic that in some ways this feels like an outgrowth of your story from Old Moon Quarterly 3, whose name escapes me, I'm sorry. But is it just this case of it's not, I don't think it's like a shared world, or is it? How strong is that connection? Or was it just you tried out some ideas, used language maybe in that story, and then we're like, okay, whole new setting, whole new everything. How does that process?
Oh, certainly. Well, the story in Old Moon Quarterly 3 was titled The Feast of St. Otmar, I think. And it's set in the same world, and it's set actually with some of the same characters. So the narrator of that story is the narrator of this story, Hieronymus. And yeah, so the story started, I think, I wrote The Feast of St. Otmar. It's one of the first stories that I ever wrote with the conscious purpose of trying to get it published. And that one I probably worked on again for about 3 years before I felt that it was ready for other humans to look at it. And so I like a lot of the themes and a lot of the characters that I worked with in that story, and I felt like I wanted to keep working with them in the novella. And so that's kind of how that came to be.
Well, not to leap practically to the end, but why not leap around a little bit? Okay, so you now spent more time in the novella. Now you had the novella written. Do you feel like, yeah, I want to keep playing in the sandbox? Do you see yourself returning to, if not these exact characters, the setting, or do you feel like, okay, I'm ready to move on to other things? How's your feeling about that?
No, I think I'm actually still working on some stories in the same setting. I have one currently that I was contacted to write for I guess I don't know how much I can say about this, but for an upcoming anthology, I sent in a story about this same character and same two of the same characters from the story. And I'm working on another longer piece dealing with the same characters, kind of like an epistolary novel kind of thing.
Well, that's awesome, man. So it sounds like you found like a thick, rich vein of imagination to mine there, and I'm happy about it because I want to see more of these guys. Now, to flip back to more, early interview kind of questions, I said it's a gothic fantasy, but what does that mean to you? Why did you choose to say put a gothic fantasy and not, I don't know, a ripping sword and sorcery tale or a this or that or something else in the cover? Why gothic fantasy and what does a gothic fantasy mean to you?
Well, I think I'm sure for people who are very much into Gothic fiction, with a capital G, it might come as somewhat of a disappointment because I don't think it's very similar to something like The Monk or I mean even Northanger Abbey, however Gothic that is, or the Castle of Otranto or something. But I think in the rich history of the word Gothic being used for Gothic architecture, Gothic art, Gothic literature, Gothic music, Gothic fashion. I think it's, I will say, a vibes-based descriptor in many of the cases, and I think the vibe that it speaks to for me is something that feels a lot like the opening scenes, and pretty much actually the entire movie of Bram Stoker's Dracula from 1992. I think about the first 5 minutes of that film, where it's just Gary Oldman screaming in Romanian, wearing this amazingly impractical but also cool-looking suit of red armor, and stabbing a cross, and blood comes out of the cross, and he drinks the blood, and he screams at Anthony Hopkins dressed like a Orthodox priest, and I really love every part of that, and I love the rest of the movie too. But I kind of wish that they had taken those first 5 minutes and made them into their own film. And so when I think of a Gothic fantasy, I think kind of something that conjures up that feeling, or perhaps conjures up the feeling of, I guess, me listening to, I don't know, the Sisters of Mercy and black metal, which is not very much similar to Sisters of Mercy, but I feel like has perhaps a similar vibe that it makes me feel. So listening to those kinds of music, watching films like Bram Stoker's Dracula or films like Near Dark. Have you ever seen the '80s vampire flick?
Yeah.
Not very similar to Bram Stoker's Dracula in terms of setting. It takes place, I think, in like the South in the American '80s, American South in the '80s rather. But I think that the emotion of the characters and how they feel very strongly about something. Oftentimes, the emotions can be quite negative, but there is something vaster that they are dealing with. That sense of, I don't even know. I suppose I'll stop rambling before I get too off topic. But I think that notion of struggling with something vaster than themselves, and doing so often in a sort of melancholic tone. Is sort of the idea that I was thinking of when I called it a Gothic fantasy. I think I didn't call it a sword and sorcery fantasy because I think I sometimes worry that when I bill stuff as sword and sorcery, I know that this novella doesn't hit a lot of the same tropes that I think a lot of sword and sorcery does. In some ways it does, in some ways it doesn't. And so I wouldn't want to mislead a reader into thinking, oh, this is going to be like a Conan novella or an Elric novella. I don't know that it's very similar to those. And so I wouldn't want somebody to pick it up and be like, oh, this is going to be this really, it's going to be like People of the Black Circle, or it's going to be like The Dreaming City. And it ends up being like, oh, this is not that. So I don't want somebody to feel that. So I wouldn't have called it a sword and sorcery story for that reason. I hope nobody picked it up hoping that they're going to read Northanger Abbey or The Castle of Otranto.
It would be
Um,
amazing if they did.
yeah,
I especially
that's a
Northern
tough.
Abbey, right, which is kind of a spoof of Gothic stuff in its own way. I think you absolutely made the right call, but I do think there's a lot here for sword and sorcery fans as well. Certainly there's a sense of the newness and the strange. You're not out here, hitting us over the head with detailed magic systems. There's a sense of mystery and horror in this whole thing that I felt was very in that vibe. And it's not exactly devoid of action, now is it? But the fact to some of the details you were giving, never mind sword and sorcery specifically. Yeah, I think struggle is the word. I was reading this and over and over again. I just feel like the pleasure was the tension, and mainly our two fellows here, Hieronymus and Prospero, but other characters too. I think just having big feelings with a capital B and a capital F rolling inside them that could definitely manifest in heads getting cut off, and just kind of wrestling with it. I mean, Prospero a little more so. I won't say more because I don't want to spoil anything, but both characters certainly are just constantly wrestling with this. And what's kind of fun is hearing them try to resolve it with words. Like I said, the folks, if you want some action, you want some bloodletting, you want some weird creatures, it's all there. But this, and I say this like in the positive sense, was a very chatty novella, and I'm here for it because the dialogue was really well written. And actually, that brings me to something I want to ask you about. These guys are not speaking like they're from Poughkeepsie. They're definitely from, well, I guess I would say Elfland, but you know what I mean. To those who aren't familiar, sorry, I'm alluding to an essay that Ursula K. Le Guin wrote called, from Elfland to Poughkeepsie, basically imploring fantasy writers to use fantastic language to try and take us somewhere else. And I definitely felt transported by the language in this book. And Graham, I've read, saying elsewhere that you make a point of really trying to read texts from the era that you're trying to set this thing in. What would maybe be some of those texts that you were wallowing in for this? And I'll have a follow-up question, but I'll let you answer that first.
Sure. Well, I think it's kind of a two-part answer. The texts that inform the actual dialogue itself probably aren't very medieval because all the medieval texts that I read are in translation. I don't speak Old French or Old German or I guess Middle High German or whatever I can kind of read Middle English, so I can read like Chaucer. It's a little bit easier. But trying to read something like the Pearl Poet in Middle English is probably a little bit beyond me. So I read those in translation, and oftentimes the translators who translate them do so consciously into a more modern English. That doesn't sound. They're trying to get away from sort of the these and the thous and the sort of 19th century feel of the language. And so if I were to mimic those, so I'm thinking of in terms of tone and atmosphere. I did look to some medieval texts. One of them would have been, and I'm sure I'm going to mispronounce it because the title I think is French, but Père Le Beau, also called the High History of the Holy Grail, which is a 12th century chivalric romance. It's anonymous. We're not sure who wrote it. There's some theories out there. I think one of them is that it was somebody who was quite traumatized by experience in wars of the time. Because it's an Arthurian romance, but it's quite a bit bloodier and grimmer than many of the other ones of the time. But anyways, the translation I read was done by Nigel Bryant, and it's very much more modern language. But in terms of the atmosphere, I would say it captures a lot of what I was trying to do. In terms of the dialogue, I was reading a lot of. Well, let's see. I probably read Gene Wolfe's book, The New Sun, about 1 million times while writing this, and also his novella Tracking Song, which doesn't really not necessarily the same style as Book of the New Sun, a little bit more plainer in style, but probably one of my favorite novellas ever. And it's in, I think, his first short story collection, The Island of Dr. Death and Other Stories and Other Stories, which is, I suppose, a bit of a joke on his part.
Yeah, I like that.
But anyway, so I was reading those. I was reading Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian, Outer Dark, and his Border trilogy. And let's see what else. The Worm Ouroboros by E.R. Edison. Herman Melville's Moby Dick. Oh, let's see what else. I think that's probably comprehensive enough.
Well, that's a
I would
hearty pile to be working through
indeed.
there, and so I'm curious when you're writing this, right? Is it that you have maybe like a big notebook full of phrases and sentences and words that you kind of like dip in and out of, like, oh, it's a good place to drop that in, or is it less precise and more just you kind of keep dipping your feet and your legs or whatever into the pool of these books that you mentioned, just in between writing sessions to kind of keep your head in a certain space? Is it more vibes or is it more precise, like ripping pieces of language that you specifically want to use? Because I can see doing this like well, again, I'm trying to see like three questions. So let's just stick with that one for now. How was it for your choice of language and how precise you were in terms of let's just say ripping specific phrases and words, or just kind of swimming in the research material and letting it come through you?
Certainly. So I think I do a little bit of both. What I'll do before I sit down to write is I'll often start reading from one of the books that I want to use kind of as sort of my guides for the writing process. And so I'll sit down and I'll read through wherever I am in the book at that point and see what it has. I guess I just try and see how it makes me feel. And I think, okay, how do I feel like the author accomplished making me feel that feeling? And then I try and think of, well, how did they do that? And then I try and do some of that on the page myself. I do also keep a very large document full of my favorite quotes from everything that I read. And so whenever I come across something, be it a quote or what I mean, it's always a quote, but whether it's a line or a paragraph or even just a clause, like an image, a stanza from a poem. I suppose I was also reading a lot. I kept rereading John Milton's Paradise Lost and Alfred Tennyson's Idylls of the King. Well, right, let's actually have Idylls of the King right here.
Oh, nice.
Um, Indeed. But anyway, so I keep a running list of those quotes, and if I feel stuck in an area, what I'll do is I'll go back and I'll read some of those quotes and try and find one that sticks with me and makes me feel like, okay, that was a really cool image, that was a really cool moment, or a really cool metaphor, a really cool feeling, or a really cool, I don't know, just way of phrasing something. And then I'll think again, how can I do this in my own? How can I do something similar in my own writing? I don't want to ape what they're doing, but I don't. Yeah, as in, I don't want to take what they're doing and then just put it on the page and recombine the names into something new.
Yeah.
In that sense, but I try and think of how it makes me feel and how I could make a writer feel, or not a writer, rather a reader feel something similar.
Well, I hope any writers who are interested in trying to do this kind of thing listened carefully there, because I think you just gave a really good method for kind of swimming in your influences, but preserving your own voice, which is the challenge, right? I mean, I think we've all done that thing, usually, in our teens and early 20s. I went, like a lot of people when I was like 20, I went on a huge Hunter S. Thompson kick. And Jesus Christ, read a manuscript I wrote 10 minutes after I put down, The Great Shark Hunt or something. And yeah, there was not a lot of Oliver in there. But yeah, I think, I think that sounds like a pretty good method. I mean, and how was it in the editing for refining the voice? Did you feel like there was just like a giant dial labeled Gothic that you were like turning up and down to get the right place? Or I'm guessing it was a little more precise than that. How was editing the language to get to that sweet spot for you?
I think so. My process is very inefficient. I probably end up writing about two or three times more in terms of word count than what I end up using in the text. So I think it's about 23,000 or 24,000 words,
Hmm.
and I think I probably have about a 75,000 word document of all the things that I edited out of it. Um, and so what I usually do is I write I end up writing quite a bit more than what I know I'm going to use, and then I go through and I think, okay, I have perhaps three different metaphors or something stupid like that, or four different images that I throw into this paragraph. That's bad. I can't have that many images or metaphors in a paragraph, and I'm sure there are places in the novella where I still have too many. But what I do is I see, okay, which one do I like the best, and that's the one that gets to stay. Or I might have several different versions of a scene, and I think, okay, how do I want the characters to develop through this scene? Where do I want them to end up by the end of the story? what makes sense for them, what would make what would help this resonate with a reader later on, what would be a good setup for this moment that I want to build to. How can I make that make more sense earlier in the story without totally just lampshading it and being like, haha, here's something important.
Yeah.
And so after considering what I want to do and perhaps bouncing some ideas off my beta readers, which is usually my wife Caitlin and my fellow editor and friend at Old Moon Julian, I then say, okay, here's how I want to approach this. I have all these different versions of it written, all these different images and sentences that I could use. I think I'm going to try and pick these ones, see how they work together, and see how I like that when I put it all together in a draft. So, and it is funny you mentioned about turning the dial of Gothicness up or down. I wish I did have a big novelty dial that's
It would be
Gothic.
simple, I suppose. Yeah.
Yes, I could just tune it like it's like the gauge or something on an amp. Um, but I do a lot of passes. This is part of the inefficiency of the process. Is I think a lot of people are advised not to edit while you write, and I find it very difficult to do. I edit while I write constantly.
I don't think that advice is always solid, in my opinion. Like to pick a guy who's pretty well established, William Gibson, apparently, well, I mean, this is what he says. Every time he sits down to write again, sits down to the same novel manuscript, he has to sort of pass through everything from the first page to wherever he left off. And he always adds the tweaks and nudges things along the way. So he's perpetually editing, and he's done all right. So, don't be charging yourself for being inefficient. Anyway, sorry, please continue.
Certainly, that's actually not too dissimilar from what I do. Whenever I sit down to write, I usually do. I read through the whole thing up to the point where I'm working at, and see how it all hangs together. And I think with so the writing of the novella is certainly more stylized than a lot of than perhaps is the norm for the moment for the moment in the writing world. And I think one of the risks you run when you have more stylized prose like that is that if the illusion that you're crafting with that prose, that sort of transportation to Elfland, cracks for even a moment, I think you can really lose the reader, and it can make the rest of that prose, before and after that moment where it cracks, it can make it feel false. It can really make it feel not good for the reader, and kind of take them out of it, and make them just check out of the writing altogether. And I've seen that happen in other books that I've read and other stories that I've read that try to do something similar and don't always succeed. I think if you do it purposefully, it can work really well. Roger Zelazny would do that quite often, like in the Amber series, where it has this kind of very neo-noirish tone, but there are moments where he gets a little bit more, I'll say, archaic with it, or perhaps a little bit more, the style changes. And those moments of dissonance work really well for him. And sometimes they choose to undercut the tension or highlight a moment of humor, or just really elevate a scene in a certain way. Laird Barron also does that really well, especially in his dark fantasy stories. I think he calls them his antiquity cycle. I am very bad at that, but I really like a lot of more modern fiction that has sort of a more sardonic and kind of sarcastic, perhaps, tone. And that creeps into the writing quite often while I'm doing it. And so there are moments where I have to make sure that when I'm combing over this text and editing it, that the tone stays consistent, and there aren't these moments where it dips out into a more perhaps a dissonantly, if that's a word, modern voice that will take the reader out. I think that if I were to, I think that's a fine style to write in. I love quite a few stories written like that, but I think that in this story, at least, and and there were a few moments that beta readers pointed out to me where it did creep in. I had to go back and edit it out. But I think that in this kind of story, it would end up not working terribly well. It would end up kind of undercutting things in a way that isn't useful.
Yeah, I can see that. There were moments where the tone varied for sure. I mean, it's not like everybody's listening to this. Don't worry, it's not like a dirge on one end of the piano just honking on those three keys. No, it definitely varied tone, and there were a couple points where it made me laugh, like in a positive fashion. Some turn of phrase or whatever the guys use, joshing with each other. But it felt consistent as a whole, and I think the word that kept coming to mind as you were talking there that makes the difference for all of this sort of thing is just intentionality, right?
Mhm.
Zelazny didn't do what he was doing there, by chance. It was. I assume it was carefully chosen. Whereas I think sometimes we can get so caught up in just the general vibes of the story that we're writing, and just enjoying ourselves so much that we lose some of that intentionality. And frustratingly, then you put the manuscript in front of, say, a beta reader, and they're like, "Yeah, there's these problems," and you're like, "No, it felt so good while I did it." And you're like, "Yeah, I'm not you. I'm not having that experience you had at the keyboard. I'm like a person reading it somewhere else entirely." Yeah, yeah, and that's the whole thing. And yeah, over and over again, I hear you saying, well, I'm thinking about, well, how's this going to make the reader feel? So there you go. There's that intentionality that saves it, that makes it, elevates it. Um, yeah, I wouldn't mind hearing a little bit your thoughts about tone and camp. So this is not a campy book, but you mentioned those beautiful opening 5 minutes to Bram Stoker's Dracula, and I know you have been published by Black Library, and maybe published again by them. And then in the, if I remember correctly, it was Warhammer, not the Warhammer 40K universe.
Yes, yeah, I've written 3 stories thus far for Black Library's Age of Sigmar
Right.
universe, which is a
Okay.
fantasy one.
I,
Yeah.
I'm not as familiar with the Age of Sigmar, where I do understand that like the Warhammer fantasy universe got kind of like imploded and everything went up into the sky, and there was whole much more god tier stuff going on. I won't pretend I'm an expert, but I'm curious then, because I'm way more familiar with 40k, and 40k I think of as incredibly campy, incredibly like just in the sense of just everything cranked up to 11, and then like another notch on the dial if they can manage it. And then I think about that opening to Bram Stoker's Dracula, which is delightful. And I will never forget that red ribbed. I think it's a Spanish type of armor too. It makes no sense in the context, but it looks so badass. But so much of what's the joy of the movie is, in a sense, cranking things up to 11, but then like I don't know, finding a place like it. Bram Stoker's Dracula, as I recall, I only rewatched it a couple of years ago. It never hits like intentional comedy. There's lots of points people find funny because why not, right? It wasn't gunning for that. Now, as I said, this novella, there were a couple points that sort of amused me because there was some good banter between the fellows. But in terms of that kind of intensity, the more is more, or almost more is more. You know, again, maybe it's just vibes, maybe it's just watching yourself and checking with your beta readers, and there's nothing more to say to it. But you know, did you ever feel sometimes when you were really in like the good writing place, when you were really just jamming on the goddamn thing? How did you know when to pull back? How did you know when to not make something, 20 feet tall instead of 12 feet tall? Do you know what I'm saying? Or how not to make a guy's dialogue like so arch? Because I literally have a character that I'm writing right now, which I'm not going to talk about because the point is your book, but I have like a character that like I write that person when I'm in that mood and don't feel like pulling back. I have to have some kind of outlet for it. And like, how do you feel about this and the context of this book and your writing in general? And you just want to like go to 11 and then beyond, or when you don't want to?
Well, I think I worry constantly that I go too over the top, and I think that I grew up really liking 40k and Warhammer. Some of the first books that I ever read were I have an older brother. He's 10 years older than me, and he had a whole bunch of Warhammer 40k and Warhammer Fantasy stuff from early on, from like the early 90s. We've been when the early mid 90s when I was a little kid, and I remember loving those books. And they're crazy. The art, it has this John Blanche art. Everything is skulls and dirty black and white ink. People with like half their face is a robot, the other half is a scowling Dolph Lundgren man. They're wearing armor that's like shaped like somebody's flayed muscles. It's very I think very fun. And I think it can get over the top and campy in a certain sense. I think 40k used to lean into that a lot more, because I think being campy in that sense was really popular in the 80s and 90s. I think they've gotten away from it in the last few probably years, possibly decades at this point. I suppose I don't know, but I think for me, I read through it and I try and think. I'm like, okay, how um, let's see, what do I'm trying to think of what I actually, because this is a worry that I have, and so I try and work through it by, I think, I think I play a game with myself where I imagine I'm the editor. This is written by somebody who's not me, and I have no attachment to these characters other than I must help this writer get better. and I must help them appeal to an audience of more than just themselves and their very loving wife and best friend. And so what I'll do is I'll read through it and I'll say, okay, cool idea, but perhaps a little bit too much. So, for example, I really like Gnosticism and medieval Neoplatonism. Esoteric concepts. I don't think it's very convincing as a way of viewing the world, but I think it makes really cool world building for a fantasy world. And they talked. Well, I won't get into it, but medieval theologians had a very, I will say, RPG-esque approach to logically building out how the world worked and how salvation worked and how magic essentially worked as well. And a lot of it is really interesting to me. And they spent a lot of time debating it. And one of the characters in the novella is essentially a medieval clerical scholar, Valpurga. And she, at one point, I had a discussion with her and another woman in her religious order where they were debating on the theological nature of divine love and worldly love, which was a very important debate in the medieval era, and one that a lot of people spent a lot of time on, especially as we shaded into the Renaissance and sort of the Renaissance humanism and the rebirth of Platonism in full force as I think Ficino ended up going to Greece and getting, or I think maybe the Greeks came to Italy. And either way, Marsilio Ficino translated all of the extant Plato that they had at that point into Latin and kind of revived Platonic studies in a big way in Europe. Anyways, I wanted them to have this discussion that would have had, that in my mind, would have had all sorts of plot relevant and character relevant implications for the rest of the novella. And so I wrote that, and it was 3,000 words long, and I was like, yep, that makes sense. I'm going to put that right in the middle, right between these two fights with giant snake people. And so I did that, and then Caitlin, my wife, read it, and she looked at me, and she was like, I think that it's really cool that you think this is cool. but I don't understand what they're talking about, and I really like she loves Valpurga. It's one of my favorite characters of hers. She's like, I really like this character, and I want to see her keep doing stuff, but I fear that you might lose somebody who's not as into this stuff as you are, and I wouldn't want that to happen. And I think you need to dial it back a little bit because it gets a little bit over the top. And so I was like, I get it. And so as it is written, so it shall be done. And so I dialed that back because I thought that perhaps them taking the time to have this super in-depth conversation about this esoteric topic that I really think is cool it wasn't the place for it in this context. And perhaps it would have ended up seeming so over the top and so involved that it would have shaded from this is a serious conversation about philosophically relevant topics or whatever, and it just becomes kind of silly and like, why are we doing this?
It can't make me. You remind me of a phrase I made up a long time ago to gently rib. Not that I knew him personally, but just when discussing this author with other people. Brian K. Vaughan. I don't know if you ever read any of his comics. The one of his I know the most is called Y, as in just the capital letter colon the last man, where a plague wipes out all the men, humans and animals as well. Anyway, point is, he writes a mean story. I should be so lucky as to have his career. But I would occasionally accuse him of having Wikipedia mouth, which is when you know the author is just like, God damn, I found some great research. Doesn't have a lot of foothold in this story, but I'm gonna put it in there anyway, or I'm gonna put in all of it. And yeah, it's not one of the struggles, man. But well, for what it's worth, I felt that there were some cool specific ideas, and I liked the discussion to the degree that I got to enjoy it in this novella. So, the dial felt set well. But it's interesting to hear about that experience you had. I love Caitlin's phrasing there. It's cool that you think this is cool. It's perfect. I'm gonna sort of veer left for a second here out of craft and or more specific craft questions. I'm just curious, man. You have a brother, I feel like now I'm an only child. I could maybe try and write a story like this, but I think it would come out real different. I think it would help if I had a brother. Sure, if I wanted to write a story like this. We are primarily following two guys. I don't recall if their ages are mentioned, but Prospero feels a little further along than Hieronymus, and certainly seems the more experienced warrior. And underneath all this conversation of fate and the world around them and strangeness and morals and wrestling with your feelings, just a couple of brothers on like a fuck about in the woods with their swords. I got that vibe sometimes. Did you find yourself thinking much upon your relationship with your brother or brothers and siblings in general while writing these two characters?
Yeah, I did. I think part of what inspired the story in general is that I read a couple of novels that were highly recommended to me, and I thought they were really cool. But there were parts of them that to me stuck out as feeling a little bit insincere, or as if they were written by somebody who didn't necessarily have, I don't even know what you would call it. I mean, maybe the lived experience. I don't know. They didn't really. To me, it didn't resonate with how I've experienced guys who like to hit stuff with swords or punch things. It didn't resonate with for me for how they would interact with each other, and that's totally fine. I think there's a million different ways for that sort of experience to happen. And for people, and I'm sure that the way I've experienced it is pretty unique because I'm pretty strange. My brother's also pretty strange, and my friends are also often quite strange. But part of what made me want to write this is I have some friends with whom I don't always agree with them on their takes on a number of topics, but they're still very deeply my friends. And part of what I wanted to do, and same with my brother. My brother and I don't agree on everything, but I love him more than I love almost anybody else in the world. And I felt that way for a long time. He's 10 years older than me, so I grew up when I was a little kid. He was in high school and then in college. I grew up wanting to hang out with him and be his buddy. And when I finally was old enough and we had similar enough interests and we could hang out and have cool conversations with each other, I remember it was hard for me sometimes to talk to him because I was having so much fun being his friend. I couldn't even stop smiling, and it made it hard to talk.
Oh.
But yeah, yes. But now it's about probably 20 years after that point, and we don't always agree on everything. And part of what I wanted to do when I was writing the story was kind of show a little bit how I think perhaps how I guess not even show, but perhaps navigate through the vein of literature, the venue of literature, how people who don't agree with each other but still love each other and want to be with each other, want to be each other's allies and each other's friends and each other's brothers in a sense. How they would navigate those disagreements and navigate their genuine kind of filial love for one another, and so that was part of it's a very astute of you, I think,
Well, even
to
as a
bring that up.
godless only child, I took great pleasure spending time in that space when they're having their disagreements, and when sometimes it breaks out into sparring or some form of basically punching each other in the fucking shoulder. Because yeah, I grew up rural and there was a lot of messing about in the woods with swords and Nerf guns and so on, and I just listener, if you're thinking, oh, so this is a silly story, no, but just like there's an undercurrent that I kind of felt like I picked up from that sphere of life, which was a great pleasure. Because you say like to have that freedom to disagree and work through it and still be have a tight bond. When I think so many of us go through life and feel maybe a little conflict averse, or just otherwise like feared of getting into a brouhaha with a coworker or something and being like, ah, shit, we had an argument. Well, that's it. I guess we'll never talk again. Even well into past, your younger years, you can still carry these feelings with you. And so yeah, I mean, amongst the fantasies of giant snake creatures and so on, there's also the fantasy that we can all disagree and still get along and okay. And it's not always a fantasy, which is the beautiful thing. I'm not sure if we can cover this without getting into spoilerish territory, so you can just say pass and we'll move on to the next question. But on a related note, um, God, I'm gonna sound like a therapist. What's your relationship to your father? Just dad is also an important figure in this. It's sort of more to the back end, and I don't mean that as a metaphor for God, although we can explore that if you want and look a little bit more at the religious aspect of the book. Um, but yeah, what do you? I would love to hear your thoughts on dad, and dads, and this book, and these boys we're following.
Certainly. Well, I think that so I very much love my dad. He's probably one of my favorite people alongside my brother. So I feel very close to both of them. And um, I suppose I won't talk too much about my dad and his life. He had a very tough life growing up. His parents were not very nice to him. Um, but when it came to raising my siblings and I have one brother and one older sister, um, I think he did a really good job, and he really sort of didn't he didn't participate in the same culture of violence and I suppose the lack of love that his parents showed to him. And so I really appreciated that. Obviously, so I love him and appreciate him a lot, which I think sometimes makes it easier for me to write characters who don't have a good relationship. Or perhaps, I shouldn't say it makes me easier, but I think sometimes it makes it. I have. I'm more interested in writing characters who don't have necessarily the best relationships with their fathers. Um,
Maybe because it's more novel to you as someone who had a good
yeah,
relationship and you have enough distance to be able to comfortably write it. Whereas maybe if you had an awful relationship with your father, it would be more fraught to try and do something like that on the page because you'd be sympathetic with your
perhaps.
own feelings. I don't know.
Well, I think, and also I grew up listening to my dad has had a much more colorful life than I have had, and I think some of the first stories that I ever heard that I thought were really fun were my dad's stories. He grew up, he was a biker, and had all these sorts of things that he did in the 70s and 80s before I was born, and I grew up listening to those stories and listening to his stories of growing up. And so I think some of what the stuff about fathers in this story, I think, is filtered through the lens of listening to my dad talk about my grandfather essentially, and my mom's grandfather, who obviously my mom and my dad have been together since they were in high school. So they've been together a long time. They knew each other's parents. And so having heard those stories and I suppose marinated in them for, I suppose, the majority of my life, I think that they find their way into the story a little bit. And many of my friends, I will say, also have had more fraught relationships with their dads. And I think, especially through the character of Prospero, I suppose I'll avoid spoilers, but through the character of Prospero, I think a lot of that comes through in a sense. I know if I think back to the Feast of Saint Otmer, where Hieronymus, the narrator of this story, has a quite good relationship with his father, and the whole, and I guess I won't spoil that story, but his relationship with his father and his family are a crucial point in that story as well.
Hmm.
And so I think there is a through line in there. But I think part of it is, I suppose, me thinking about how people other than myself, but who I know quite well, how they've experienced fatherhood and their relationship with their fathers, I suppose.
Cool, because ultimately, I know this word can be a bit fraught when discussing some other things, but I just felt like the female characters in the story were well developed, albeit smaller characters, and that's fine. And they were quite interesting. And actually, I would like to talk about Walpurgis in a minute, but this was definitely like a dude's rock kind of feeling as I was reading this. It felt like masculinity was a very important part of what informed it. So we kind of talked around it with brothers and dads, but did you feel at any point like I don't know what role masculinity plays in this order of knights. I mean, there's no getting around it. It's all fellas, and they're all out there punching things real hard. And and yeah, I don't know. Did you ever find yourself thinking like, well, what do these guys think like a man is supposed to be, and how do you want to express that in the story? I have to think you did, if only by some of the dialogue. But I'd love for you to share your thoughts on that with readers. What was your feelings about masculinity as they're expressed through these characters, and what you wanted to say behind that, perhaps on the topic of masculinity in the novella?
Certainly. Well, I think it's the concept of how medieval people, especially medieval knights, would have viewed masculinity, I think is a really a complex one I probably can't articulate very well in the allotted time. But it was a big influence on how I wanted to approach the story. So knighthood in the medieval era was very bound up in the idea of what makes somebody a proper man and why you would want to be a knight, according to knights themselves. If we look at works like Geoffrey Charney's Book of Knighthood, or Ramon Lull's Book of Chivalry. Both of those men were a 14th century and a 13th century French and a Spanish knight, respectively. Both wrote books on what they viewed knighthood as and how a knight should act. And both of them were very focused on the idea that being a knight was the best possible way for a man to be. And really, to be a man meant you had to be a knight, which meant you had to obey some pretty strict concepts of behavior and how you approach the world. And that informs how the knights in my novella act. So, looking at Geoffrey Charney, for example, he talks about how the most important thing for a knight to have is something he calls prowess, a virtue, which essentially means your ability to be really good at fighting and killing other people.
Yes, that was super key to your story in OMQ number 3 there. Pardon me, please continue.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so that's a really different view of masculinity than the one that I have personally as a person now. It's really different, I would assume, from the view of masculinity that most of the readers are going to have. But it was a really influential and popular form of masculinity at the time, and it shaped how they approached the world and what they did. Everything that many of these men would have done would have been, how can I conform to this ideal, or how can I live up to this ideal? How can I, if my self-worth is all bound up in how good I am at fighting. How good I am at fighting determines, will women love me? Which is, again, one of the other things they emphasize over and over again if you read chivalric romances, which, to be fair, were written for both men and women. But if you read books that knights are writing to other knights, Geoffrey Charney, Ramon Lull a little bit less, because at the time he was writing it, he was a Christian ascetic and a hermit. So he's kind of trying to move knightliness away from what he would see as the secular world, the world of carnal love, and more towards the world of spiritual love, so sacrificing yourself for your deity. But Geoffrey Charney and certainly others thought that one of the main reasons that you would want to be a knight, and one of the main aspects of masculinity and manhood in general, was your appeal to woman. And the idea was, if you have prowess, if you are a mighty warrior, then women will love you, and if you are not, then they will not love you. And if you are not loved by women, you are not worthy of being a person, in many respects. And so I think that those are some pretty interesting and pretty radical concepts, radical in the sense of both being very cool from a character development perspective, but radical also in the sense of what it does to you socially and psychologically. And so when I was writing these characters, I kind of wanted to explore from my own perspective, and I wouldn't claim I don't make any aspirations towards historical accuracy. I'm sure that if a scholar of chivalry was to read these stories, he would have a million, or he or she would have a million things to say that, well, that's not how they would have done that. That's not how they would have thought. And I think that's fine. But from my own perspective, I was trying to think of, how would somebody who's raised in that environment, who's raised in that sort of that worldview, how would they react, and how would they think, and what kind of philosophy would they create for themselves, and how would it make them feel, and how would they struggle with it? Because it's not something, it's such a, they set themselves such high standards for things that are really, really psychologically difficult. They're basing your entire life worth off of your ability to kill people. That's kind of the most traumatic thing possible that you could ever do, to yourself and to others. It's a really alien worldview in many ways, and I find it very fascinating in that sense. And part of what I wanted to do was explore that, and also explore it in a way that I think made sense to a modern reader. So it's not just a lecture from a history textbook, but it's something where you perhaps you can look at it and perhaps see parallels or feel like, oh, this makes me. I feel like perhaps in some sense I can relate to this in some way or see where they're coming from, or feel like these struggles, however, crazy and fantastical they might be, these people are battling snake monsters and skeletons and so on. I've never done that, probably never will do that, but who knows?
Probably, but yeah, we'll leave the door open. Leave the door open. Yeah, go on, sorry.
Indeed, the world, reality could alter at any minute, I suppose, but probably not. But anyways, but even though we've never done anything that fantastical, is there some connection that I have to these very outlandish and strange struggles these people are having? And I think the notion of masculinity and what it means to be a man and what it means to be a man in relation to women, which I think is something that both characters struggle with, and I think one of their main disagreements with each other. And I think also what it means to be a woman in relation to men as well. We get less of that, I think, unfortunately. But I think there's certainly a lot of it in medieval texts, and I suppose I'll stop there because I plan on hopefully trying to write some of that in some of my later stories, because I think it is a really fascinating topic how women in the Middle Ages also dealt with femininity and masculinity at the same time. Anyways, I'll stop.
Well, I'll
Yeah,
tell you right now,
going off
man.
topic.
No. This is all. How dare you? This is a podcast, sir. We never, go elsewhere with the conversation. No, I find that all quite fascinating. Thank you for sharing it. And frankly, if there ends up being essentially Walpurgia's story, or the equivalent thereof with other characters like her, I'll get that in a heartbeat, because what we did get of the women in this world was quite interesting and inferred a lot of interesting concepts I'd love to get more of. And but I enjoyed what I got. We're getting near the hour mark here, so I don't want to get too depth. But could you just expand upon maybe two small things for me? Uh, One is there was a line about a knight's longing for his nun, and that was early enough in the book that I was like, wait, so this is order like matchmake all the knights with nuns? Is that how this works, or is this just like Hieronymus kind of thinking about himself and his particular relationship with the nun? Because there was this feeling of like evoking history without trying for one-to-one perfect accuracy, which is impossible anyway, but whatever. And everything you're saying confirms that for me. So I just was kind of like, is that one of the tweaks Graham's made here? Is this a version of history where nuns are paired with knights, or was Walpurgia a unique or relatively unusual situation with her and Hieronymus? I'm just curious about that.
Well, so I think in this story, I think the relationship is fairly unique.
Okay.
The sort of the longer background explanation for that is the Order of the Dragon was a real order, but it wasn't anything like what the one I've made up in this story was. The real Order of the Dragon was what we call a chivalric order. It was created by Sigismund of Luxembourg and Barbara of Cilly, who was his wife. And actually, from what I recall, Barbara of Cilly was one of the main drivers behind the order, because she was quite integral to Sigismund's hold on power in many of his lands, because he had sort of claim to them through her. I could be misremembering that, so if some scholar of Holy Roman Imperial history listens to this, I suppose, educate me. But anyway, so the Order of the Dragon, they weren't a religious order. They weren't like Templars or the Hospitallers or the Jack Knights. What inspired the order in my stories a little bit more is the Order of Santiago, which was a Spanish crusading order, who were created during the Reconquista in Spain, and they were created by married knights. And those knights were already married, and all the other military orders of that time they weren't necessarily monks, but they took similar vows, which included chastity. And which meant that you couldn't have relationships. You can have sexual relationships with women or with men, but primarily with women would have been their concern. The Order of Santiago, because they were all married, they didn't want to give up their wives, and so they said, "Well, how about we do everything else that these other Crusader knights do, but we also get to bang?" And so they footed that idea to the Pope of the time, and he said, "You know what? Sounds like a good one." And so they came up with this idea of conjugal chastity, which is just monogamy, which
Okay.
was already a thing. And but so they were like, so they are still taking a vow of chastity, but the vow of chastity is just that you're monogamous, I guess. And but anyways, but the idea of there being a crusading order of knights who have a closer relationship with the women in the order, because the women, because if they're living, instead of living with each other in a sort of castle or a barracks type situation, they're living with, they still live with each other. They also live with their wives, and their wives have a larger presence in the order. Most of the crusading orders, women technically couldn't be part of them. They'd have sister orders that would live nearby, perhaps, that would have nuns in them. But the Order of Santiago had both men and women, and technically the wives of these men would have been nuns of this order. But anyways, so that was kind of the germ of the idea of having these nuns and these knights living in close proximity, and then having some sort of power differential. And I could get into my world building ideas about that, but the women in that order are integral to it in a way that what was not the case in in pretty much any medieval military order. But I think it is plausible, and more importantly, very fun and interesting for me to do. And so, to answer your original question, no, not all the nuns and the knights aren't paired off. Um, but the idea was originally kind of born out of this sort of interesting and contradictory medieval idea of conjugal chastity.
Well, I like that, and I think it's something worth building on. And I don't think it's spoiler for me to say that I did really like, again, like the more modest peak we got at the women in the order, and the at least I inferred that they're a lot more, part of the administration and like authorities, like not just like secretaries or something. Like they're kind of, I got the feeling like they were running the show,
Yeah,
and also
correct.
were very much in charge of like kind of the knowledge of the order. And so yeah, like hell yeah, I'll learn more about that. I desperately want to ask you why Persia has a skeleton hand, which is something given on the first page, so it doesn't feel spoilery. But I worry the answer to that is spoilery. And did I
Um,
just miss something with my reading? Was it that it
no,
was like,
no,
and she
no,
has a
no.
skeleton hand because of this, or
No, the skeleton hand is not explained in that story. It is explained in a different story that I'm writing at the moment. That
okay,
takes place before this one. But yeah, she does have a skeleton hand for relevant reasons, for plot relevant reasons, in character development relevant reasons in a different story. But yeah.
okay, cool. Well, then there you go, folks. I mean, that's something else that feels a little sword and sorcery. Not everything's explained all in one story, and also big snakes, which I always have to give credit to. I'm sorry, I don't know his real name, but Discord user Bear J, who once said, "Sword and sorcery is when the snake is big," and I love that so much. So yeah, anyway. All right. Well, I'm just gonna see one last little quick question here as I'm on our way out the door. So, okay, you're a publisher. You have some insight into things that maybe the average self-publishing author might not have. Why did you choose to go with Amazon Print on Demand as your way of, producing and distributing this book? And what for you are your sort of personal like what would you say this happens, it succeeded? Obviously we'd all like our books to go viral across the globe and make us $1 million, but outside of that, sometimes it's just getting the thing published is the goal. Sometimes you really want to, yeah. What were your goals with this book, and what would feel like they've been met?
Well, I think part of it is that we the magazine that I help edit and run with my wife, my friend Julian. We'd be interested in publishing novellas from other authors in the future, and so what we wanted to kind of have a sort of trial run at publishing and marketing a novella. And I think I at least feel much more secure doing that with my own work, because I feel like if we were to do our first novella with somebody else's work and it didn't sell very well, I would feel bad. I would feel like perhaps I'd failed them in some way, or if I tried things that didn't work, and it was my first time ever doing it. Even if I'd seen, somebody else had suggested, I've done my research and say, okay, this is how we're going to market it, and it ends up not working because of some misstep that I or Julian or Caitlin made, or whatever. Even perhaps just through chance, I would feel bad if it was somebody else's work. I feel a little bit less bad if it's my own, because it's my own work, so I don't feel as if there's a debt that I owe to somebody or an obligation that I owe to be professionally successful on their behalf or help them become professionally successful. So that's part of it. The other part is that I have very little time to learn the very developed dance and skills necessary for querying to sell a novella. If I wanted to get this published traditionally through an agent or through it would have to be through an agent, I suppose. I don't know that any publishers have really open subs at the moment. I'm sure some small presses do. But either way, I don't know enough about the process of querying at the moment, and I simply didn't feel like I had the time to spend on doing that while still being able to do my full time job and work on Old Moon and all the other obligations that I have.
Yeah.
So that was another part of it. And the other part is that we used Ingram Spark for our most recent Kickstarted issues of Old Moon Quarterly. And the royalties that you receive through Ingram Spark's distribution are quite a bit lower than if you do it through Amazon. And of course, most books are purchased, I think, online through Amazon. And the shipping to get books from Ingram Spark to other people, if I wanted to send out review copies, or if I wanted to even just order copies for myself to take to conventions that we sometimes go to and sell copies in person, the shipping costs are really quite a bit more expensive through Ingram. And our margins are thin enough that matters to us at the moment. So even just the small, even just that small, like it costs a little bit less to ship. We don't have the space to do. We could have done an offset print run as well. That's a larger investment than we wanted to do because to
Yeah,
make
it's a
that
lot more upfront.
yeah, to make it economically viable, we have to do a larger run than perhaps we thought. And perhaps this is my own anxiety speaking out of turn, but perhaps a larger print run that I thought might be sellable feasibly, within a reasonable time frame. So all of that together leads us to Amazon Print on Demand, which is kind of the I don't know, least worst option or best terrible. I don't know how to describe it. It's not my favorite. I think that
I think least worst is a good way to describe
yeah,
these things, because
yes.
there's no perfect solution. If there is one, I haven't heard of it.
Yeah, but so that was kind of so it was that combination of lack of time and all the other things that I described just now.
All good. Okay, so in closing, people can obviously find it on Amazon, folks. So search on there, and I'll put the link all over the show notes. Just click the mouse somewhere, you'll hit it, you'll get it, you'll do it. I believe in you. And I guess we sort of alluded to some things, but aside from more issues of Old Moon Quarterly, which also strongly recommended, folks. And if you go back to our archives, you can find an interview with Graham and Caitlin about that. You say you're looking forward to trying to publish novellas by other authors, and are you working? It sounds like you got a few working projects, works in progress going on. Is one of them essentially whether it's a direct sequel or just another one in this universe? It is, yeah. You mentioned, right? You're working on another novella.
Yeah, I'm working on a short. I suppose it would either at this point be a long novella or a short novel. With the same characters, it would be a prequel to this story in some sense. I mean, it would come before it in the timeline. I don't think it's not a direct prequel, but it would be before it in the timeline certainly. But yeah, so I'm working on that. We just published, or rather, we just mailed out or shipped out our two most recent issues of Old Moon Quarterly, issues 7 and 8,
right?
Yeah, which have stories by Catherine Kobler, James Eng, Laird Barron, John Langan, and a whole host of other really awesome authors. So those are both going out to our backers, and they'll be available to non-backers next month. And the ebook copy of issue 7 already out. The ebook copy of issue 8 will be available on Amazon and on our website at oldmoonpublishing.com next week. And I think in terms of other stuff we have going on, next year, early next year, we're going to have our next open submission window, and we will I suppose that's all I can talk about for
Yeah.
now in terms of things that we have going on. But I think that should cover it.
Yeah, I mean that's hearty. All right, awesome, dude. Well, as always, it's a pleasure speaking with you. Yeah, thank you for coming by. It was really nice to chat with the author of a book I enjoyed. It always is.
All right, it was very lovely to be here, and thank you very much for having me on.
No problem. So I'm writing a novel features original intro and outro music by Gloria Guns, and is hosted by yours truly, Oliver Brackenbury. If you'd like to get in touch, please email us at soimwritinganovel@gmail.com. Please consider sharing the show with anybody who might like it, or checking out any of the other ways you can support the show by heading to soimwritinganovel.com/support the show, which has things like links to our Patreon, Coffee, and PayPal. Thanks for hanging out with me, and Graham, and I'll see you soon.